It's July 2021. After months of the world coming to a standstill, daily life is returning to normal in many countries and cities. Sports fans can go back to the stadiums, the first bands and musicians are playing concerts again, and movie fans can look forward to going to the theater. Alongside a new installment of The Conjuring or The Black Throne, The Forever Purge is also hitting theaters. The Purge movies may not be cinematic masterpieces, but if you just want to be entertained by a horror universe, you get what you're looking for. Still, the late-night showing isn't too crowded when the film flickers across the screen at the Corona Theater near Los Angeles on July 26th. But when the lights come back on after the evening screening, far more than scattered popcorn or a leftover box of nachos awaits the staff. 2 people did not survive the screening. Anthony Barajas and Rylee Goodrich have only known each other for a few weeks. The 19-year-old and the 18-year-old met at a party over the July 4th weekend, celebrating U.S. Independence Day. And now, just under 3 weeks later, their first real date is coming up. Anthony is the kind of guy who loved being the center of attention back in high school, in the best possible way. He graduated in 2019 with top grades as the celebrated star of his soccer team. He played leading roles in many theater productions and also sang in the choir. He has nearly 1 million followers on his TikTok account. He actually makes enough money from it to live off of. Even though a friend later says that Anthony really shows his most glamorous side on TikTok, he's actually totally down to earth. When Rylee Goodrich's father hears that she wants to date a TikToker, he's anything but thrilled at first. Rylee, too, has the typical dream resume of an American teenager. She also graduated from high school with excellent grades and was an active cheerleader for years. She also plays volleyball and enjoys running. She's just recently graduated from high school and has started taking courses toward a degree in business marketing. Before she went to college the previous summer, she helped out her father, who works as a private investigator. So Rylee and Anthony are totally on the same wavelength. Right after they met, Anthony was set to go on vacation to Hawaii, but the two stayed in touch online. And Anthony even came back from vacation with souvenirs for Rylee and her family. Not only Rylee, but her parents are also blown away. Rylee's father also finds Anthony much nicer than he would have expected, especially since the 19-year-old even says himself that social media is just a job. He acts a certain way there because that's just how the business works. After meeting him for the first time, it's clear to Rylee's parents that Anthony is actually quite different in real life. An all-around likable guy who clearly really likes Rylee. No wonder the 18-year-old is excited on the evening of July 26, 2021. She and Anthony have planned a romantic date. First, they plan to go out to eat, then to the movies. So far, the two have never met alone. This makes it all the more important for Rylee to nail the perfect look for the date. Together, Rylee and Anthony head out in the early evening to the Crossings Mall in Corona, southeast of Los Angeles. First, they go to Wood Ranch for dinner. The restaurant chain is best known for its meat dishes, which are prepared over a wood-fired grill. The mall also houses a large movie theater, Regal Edwards Cinema. At 9:35 p.m., the screening of The Forever Purge begins in Theater 15. The theater is almost empty. Anthony and Rylee manage to snag good seats in the middle. Their evening together is lovely, but the movie, on the other hand, leaves a lot to be desired. Shortly before the end, Rylee even texts her mother, saying the movie is a total flop and just plain stupid. It is the last message the 18-year-old will ever send. When the movie ends and the lights come back on in the theater, Anthony and Rylee will no longer be alive. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., the lights come back on in Theater 15 at Regal Edwards Cinema. A few minutes later, a single employee enters the theater to sweep up scattered popcorn from the floor and collect the empty drink cups. The whole thing should be a quick job. After all, only 6 tickets were sold for the showing. But when the employee enters the theater, 2 people are still sitting in the middle section. They have slumped in their cushioned seats and are covered in blood. An emergency doctor and the police are called immediately, but 18-year-old Rylee is pronounced dead on the spot in the theater. The young woman had apparently been shot in the head from behind. Anthony is initially taken to a nearby hospital, but there is little hope for him either. Anthony dies 5 days later from his injuries, at the age of just 19. Several of his organs are donated after his death, giving others a new lease on life. News of the brutal attack on the 2 teenagers spreads rapidly through the California media. The shock is immense, as no one can explain who could have harmed Rylee and Anthony, especially since no one else was in the theater when the 2 were found there. No one heard the shots either, neither in the adjacent theaters nor in the lobby. The forensic investigation is different from that in conventional criminal cases. After all, dozens of different people sit in that theater every day. The most promising leads are a bullet and 3 shell casings found in Theater 15, and the booking data for those who watched The Forever Purge on the evening of July 26th. Because there is a high probability that the perpetrator is among them. By the very next day, the police have a promising lead. The 4 remaining tickets were sold as adjacent seats to a single person, apparently a group of friends. And most importantly, they were purchased on the Regal Edwards Cinema website. There, buyers are required to provide their real name and full address. Within a few hours, the police are at the door of the person who bought the movie tickets. The buyer stated that he had gone to the cinema with 3 friends, but that the visit had not gone without incident. The police were initially able to question 3 of the 4 friends. Essentially, they all said the same thing, which an investigator summarized as follows. In the middle of the film, Joseph left the theater and returned with a bag, which he told them contained a strap. The witnesses assumed this referred to a handgun. They reported that Joseph had been muttering to himself and talking to himself, which made them feel uneasy. They claimed they needed to use the restroom, but instead left the theater and left Joseph behind. 2 of the 3 friends hung around outside the mall afterward, after leaving the theater. At 11:28 p.m., they reportedly saw their friend Joseph run out of the theater and speed away in his car. That was 7 minutes before an employee found Rylee and Anthony covered in blood. The 3 friends also state that they had read about the double murder at the theater in the news earlier that day. They all say they immediately thought their buddy Joseph Jimenez must be responsible, but none of them alerted the police. Investigators spend most of July 27th questioning the 3 friends of this Joseph and, in the background, preparing to arrest the 20-year-old. Curiously, it is the suspect himself who informs the police that evening. At 9:30 p.m., he makes an emergency call and claims he is being followed. And his hunch is spot on, because undercover officers have been tailing him to arrest him near his registered address. When the officers move in, Joseph is armed. Fortunately, however, the officers are able to defuse the situation, and no one is injured. While Joseph is taken to jail on suspicion of murder, the trailer where he lives is searched. There, they find a gun of the same caliber as the one used to kill Rylee and Anthony. In addition, they find an illegal drum magazine, which allows the shooter to fire numerous rounds before having to reload. And Rylee's wallet is found in the suspect's car. There could hardly be more evidence. And Joseph does not deny the crime, but goes on the offensive. A month after his arrest, Joseph Jimenez gave an interview from prison. In it, he told the journalist that he suffers from schizophrenia. He said he killed Rylee and Anthony after hearing voices for months. However, he admitted that he hadn't been taking his medication recently because he had run out of pills. At first, the voices he claims to have heard threatened to take things away from him, such as his TV or his car. Sometimes, however, these voices also told him that his own friends and family would be killed. The journalist then asks whether Joseph thought the only way to protect those around him was the double murder. He replies, basically, yes. On July 26th, the voices had been so overwhelming that he couldn't concentrate on the movie. The fact that it was a horror movie didn't matter. It was simply the unbearable voices in his head. So, he got up and left the theater. However, not to drive home to calm down or get help. Instead, he tells the journalist, he went to his car and took a firearm out of the trunk. According to investigators, it was likely a so-called ghost gun. It was assembled from various parts of other weapons, allowing Joseph, as the buyer, to bypass the federal background check required for purchasing a firearm. When he returned to the theater with it, his friends fled. However, they did so without alerting the other people in the auditorium or the theater staff. Joseph says he and his friends had seats almost at the very back, so Rylee and Anthony were sitting in front of them. The two were the only remaining audience members in the auditorium after Joseph's friends had fled. And that was it, the only reason he murdered the couple. Simply because they were the only two people in the theater, and he somehow believed that if he didn't commit the double murder, his own family would be in danger. He doesn't explain the exact details. In the interview, Jimenez describes how he approached the two from behind. First, he shot Rylee. Anthony then flinched violently. Then, he immediately opened fire on him as well. It was only because of that flinch that Anthony's head moved enough that he didn't die immediately. Unlike Rylee, he wasn't shot in the back of the head, but in the side, through the eye. Incidentally, Joseph Jimenez's three friends are not being prosecuted. Under current law, they are not guilty of failure to render aid or anything similar. A law professor explains it this way. They did not behave like good citizens, but there is no obligation to report suspicious behavior or to report it if one believes that someone is about to commit a crime. Joseph Jimenez, on the other hand, cannot, of course, refute the charges. In court, he recounts once again that he believed the voices had come from the rows in the middle of the auditorium. There had been two voices that had been tormenting him for months. A female voice, which he calls Abigail, and another. It was only because this had been so distressing to him that he had purchased the firearm in the first place, to protect himself. Joseph Jimenez says he was sometimes unsure whether the voices existed only in his imagination or in reality. But on that evening at the movie theater, he was certain that the voices were those of real people. Over and over, they had said, "We're coming to get you." It had all started even before the trip to the movie theater. Joseph and his three friends had been out to eat at Romano's Macaroni Grill Nemo. While eating, he had the gun with him and thought he heard voices coming from the restaurant's kitchen. However, he didn't let on that he'd heard anything. After dinner, he drove home briefly, Joseph says. When he then drove to Crossings Mall, he left his firearm in the car to go into the movie theater. However, he got up halfway through the movie to retrieve it. Joseph now says that, back in the theater, he showed his friends the bag containing the gun. Then, he signaled to them with a nod that they should leave. Incidentally, Joseph is not on trial solely for double murder. As he himself admits, he also robbed the two victims after the crime. He climbed over the seriously injured Anthony to get Rylee's wallet. Since all the evidence points against him, Joseph's strategy is to plead not criminally responsible due to his mental state. In a sense, he had already laid the groundwork for this defense shortly after his arrest during the prison interview. The presiding judge acknowledges parts of what Joseph said. There is no doubt about the schizophrenia diagnosis, nor about the fact that the defendant had not been taking his medication recently. But the judge sees many more indications that Joseph was, in fact, in full possession of his mental faculties on the evening of the crime. For one thing, he stole Rylee's wallet even after the double murder. Furthermore, Joseph apparently asked a kiosk employee for her number before the movie, and he seemed perfectly normal while doing so. Furthermore, the judge continued, Joseph himself stated that he had warned his friends before the murder. Joseph himself says that he signaled to his friend with a nod that they should leave the theater. And finally, after his arrest, he initially said nothing about the voices. That apparently came up only later. All of this led to the court's decision that Joseph Jimenez is fully criminally responsible. Accordingly, he is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, the court-appointed defense attorney makes a point that is, at least in part, a valid objection. Namely, that the double murders were also a product of the healthcare system. This is a thoroughly justified criticism of the healthcare system, which leaves much to be desired, particularly when it comes to mental health issues. However, investigators were also able to determine that Joseph had been thoroughly informed prior to the crime. He had been hospitalized multiple times for his mental health issues. Each time, he was reminded that he had to take his medication and should not use drugs. Nevertheless, he regularly ran out of his pills. In addition, he consumed alcohol and marijuana, which, in combination with his diagnosis, can have negative effects. Of course, a diagnosis can naturally contribute to people making certain decisions, but only in the rarest of cases can it serve as the sole explanation. Worldwide, tens of millions of people are affected by schizophrenia at some point in their lives and pose no danger to others. Joseph, however, ignored all the help that was offered to him. If the court is correct in its assessment that he used his diagnosis more as an excuse for the crime, then Joseph Jimenez not only killed two innocent people, but also harmed others affected by this illness. And that brings us to the end of today's video. Feel free to share your thoughts on the case in the comments. What's really on my mind is the behavior of Joseph's friends, who just walked away. I wonder how I would have handled the situation. I'm interested in how you see the whole thing, both morally and legally, of course. Let me know in the comments. Other than that, there isn't much more to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever time you're watching this, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.